What's a horrible secret you witnessed as a child but understood later? Story 1. I grew up in an evangelical, unaffiliated church. They believed in speaking in tongues, demon possession, and exorcisms. A local boy I befriended, maybe 12 or 14 at the time, lived in the apartments near our church. He was poor, rough around the edges. He cursed, smoked, and mostly fended for himself. But on Sunday and Wednesday nights, he started showing up at church. One night, for some reason, someone decided he needed prayer. A group of adults put their hands on him, trying to save his soul. He didn't like it, so he pulled away and cursed at them. That apparently was all the proof they needed that he was possessed. Several men wrestled him out of the pew and held him down while he screamed, kicked, and fought them off. They pinned him there for hours, praying over him until he was exhausted, bruised, and barely moving. Only then did they declare that the demon had finally left. The 100 or so onlookers didn't see anything wrong with it. They just started praying, crying, and dancing around in celebration. That was a normal church night, maybe a little more intense than usual. The boy never came back, and in hindsight, it's shocking that no one ever called the police. Looking back as an adult, I realized just how disturbing that was, how terrifying it must have been for him. Story 2. I was around 5 or 6 when I woke up to my mom screaming for help. My dad rushed into the room, grabbed my youngest brother, and desperately tried to revive him, performing CPR with everything he had. I didn't understand what was happening. No one was explaining anything to me. I just stood there, frozen, until the ambulance arrived, and I was sent to a neighbor's house. My brother was born with a lung condition, though after 18 years, I can't remember exactly what it was. At night, he was hooked up to a machine that helped him breathe. But PG&E failed to notify us that they were doing maintenance on a transformer outside. They cut the power, and because of that, his machine shut off. He suffocated in his sleep. I didn't fully process it at the time. It wasn't really talked about much after. But one night, years later, I was in the car with my parents when Dreaming of You by Selena started playing. Something inside me broke. I started crying uncontrollably, asking my parents why he had to be taken from us, telling them how much I missed him. To this day, I still can't listen to that song. Rest in peace, baby David. Someday, I'll see you again. Story 3. I watched my father get arrested more times than I can count. There were nights when the police busted through our door with guns drawn, times when our house was raided. Everything flipped upside down. Total chaos. I never really understood what was happening. That changed when I was about 13. I had my best friend over for a sleepover, and he accidentally found my father's stash hidden in the rafters of the basement, where my room was. It may not sound like the worst thing, but looking back, the kind of people my dad surrounded us with was horrifying. Our house was constantly filled with transients, sketchy individuals, and even addicts, some of whom stayed with us for long periods, even with their own kids. As an adult, I can't imagine ever putting my own family in a situation like that. It was reckless, dangerous. But at the time, it was just normal. It was all I knew. I never saw my childhood as terrible. It wasn't until I grew up, started learning the truth, and realized that most kids didn't live like that I understood. It wasn't as innocent as I had believed. Story 4. Back in the early 90s when I was a high school student, I had a weekend job printing photos. Most of the time it was boring. Houses, cars, family vacations. But sometimes it was pretty interesting, especially for a teenager in a quiet town. This was before digital photography, so we saw everything that came through. Drunk party photos, aspiring model shoots, risque pictures of girlfriends or wives, and sometimes even full-on adult content. I saw and learned a lot. The owner of the store had a quiet arrangement with customers who wanted discretion. If someone brought in sensitive photos, they'd be set aside for him to develop personally after closing. Those customers would return late at night to pick them up. But every now and then, someone unfamiliar with this unwritten rule would come in asking too many questions. How fast can you print these? Are there restrictions on what can be developed? Do you look at the photos? We had clear rules. We didn't have to look at the prints, but we would see the negatives during development. Most people were fine with that. Some weren't and only wanted the film developed, not printed. One Saturday morning, a middle-aged couple came in and lingered around the store, watching me work before finally approaching the counter. They spoke quietly, asking all the usual questions, and opted for film development only. I assumed it was the usual, some private adult content, and got to work, loading their film into the developing machine. They were clearly nervous while waiting. The setup of the store worked in my favor. The photo printer was in full view, but the film developer was partially hidden behind a low wall. The entrance to the back of the store was right there. I was keeping track of the time, planning to grab their film the moment it was ready and sneak a peek. Typical teenage curiosity. Right around then, my coworker returned from break and the store got busier. Perfect. I told him I needed to grab more print envelopes from the back. On my way, I discreetly grabbed the freshly developed negatives and stepped behind the wall. I held them up to the light, expecting something tame but exciting. Instead, I felt a jolt of shock, followed by a wave of disgust and anger. My heart started pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Then came the doubt. I needed to be absolutely sure. I placed the negatives on the light board and grabbed a magnifying loupe. I forced myself to look at exactly one photo. That was all it took. I stepped away, grabbed the phone, and called the police. There's no real way to describe what I saw. The photos were definitely adult in nature, but the subjects were not. The dispatcher was quiet for a moment after I explained, then asked me how sure I was. 100%, I told her. Within minutes, the store was filled with officers. At some point, the couple had tried to slip out, but the police were already there, blocking their way. I have kids of my own now, and sometimes when I drop them off at school or watch them play at a park, I get sudden flashes of that single image. Instant fear, sweat, and a deep, unsettling awareness of the people around them. Who are they? What have they done? What are they capable of? Story 5. When I was 11, my mom and I left my dad and became homeless. But I didn't realize we were homeless until I was 20. At the time, I just thought we were on some kind of adventure. We slept in the car, stayed at friends' houses. It all felt temporary, like a game. I trusted my mom completely, so I was never scared. She had a way of making everything feel normal, even fun. Wow, I found these flavored tuna pouches. Wouldn't it be cool if we acted like cats? She'd say. Or, I bet you can't brush your teeth using only a water bottle. And of course, there was always, I'm going to leave you at the library for a while. It was just how things were. After about 2 years, we finally found a house. Now looking back, I understand what we went through. But at the time, my mom's creativity and strength shielded me from ever feeling afraid. And to clarify, yes, we were only homeless for 2 years. Ha ha. It just never really clicked for me until I was much older. And yes, I hug my mom plenty for everyone. She now has a beautiful home, 4 kittens, and will be retiring in 3 years. She's my everything. Story 6. When I was little, we had the sweetest old man living next door, Mr. Culpepper. He was the textbook definition of a kind neighbor. Always cheerful, always baking cookies for everyone in the cul-de-sac. You'd see him whistling while watering his lawn, chatting with the birds as he tended to his garden. Then one Sunday after church, we came home to several police cars parked outside his house. My dad told my sisters and me to stay in the car while he and my mom went to find out what was going on. When they came back, my mother was in tears, and my father's face was unreadable, cold, distant. Years later, when I finally asked what had happened to good old Mr. Culpepper, I learned the truth. He had taken his own life, shot himself in the head. Even worse, it was because his kids never visited him. He was completely alone. I still think about him. He didn't deserve to go out that way. Story 7. I grew up in NYC, and after school, I was looked after by a really nice couple who lived in our building. They were Puerto Rican, and the husband, Jose, spoke very little English. But that never mattered. He was basically my best friend. We spent our afternoons running errands, communicating in our own way, making the city our playground. One day, we were in a bodega when this big, loud guy walked in, acting aggressive. Jose didn't say a word. He just picked me up, carried me to the back of the store, and started letting me pick out all the junk food I was usually never allowed to have. It was amazing. Every time I held something up like, "Yo, Jose, I want these ho-hos," he'd squint at me and ask, "You sure, Poppy?" As if I were making the most important decision of my life. Cue existential crisis. I'd put them back, rethink my whole approach, and start again. Eventually, I made my choices, completely oblivious to everything else. That's when I noticed Jose acting strange. The whole store had this uneasy energy, like something had just gone terribly wrong. Then I saw it. A pool of blood near the front counter. The store owner was slumped in a chair, surrounded by concerned onlookers. Turns out, while I was busy deliberating over snacks, a lunatic with a metal pipe had come in and beaten the store owner to a pulp, screaming nonsense the entire time. We paid for our stuff, awkwardly handing cash to the guy who had just been attacked, and left. I didn't think too much about it until years later when I was talking to Jose's kids. That's when I realized just how dangerous that situation had been and how brilliantly Jose had insulated me from it. He never let me feel afraid. Story 8. My dad and I were in a plane accident, though it wasn't quite a crash. The front of the plane somehow caught fire, the cabin lost pressure, and we plummeted from cruising altitude to around 1,000 feet at a terrifying 45-degree angle. The flight was supposed to go from Florida to Connecticut, but instead we made an emergency landing in Savannah, Georgia. It was serious. At one point, a flight attendant sobbed over the intercom, telling everyone to say they loved their friends and family. But the veteran pilots we had, they saved our lives. I didn't grasp how bad it was at the time, because my dad played it like an absolute pro. When I saw smoke coming from the front of the plane, I asked him why, and without hesitation, he told me the pilots were having a barbecue. When we started plummeting, I asked why, and he calmly said, "Sometimes you have to do that when flying." What could have been a terrifying, traumatic memory just wasn't, because my dad never let me feel scared. To this day, though, he can't get on a plane without being heavily medicated. And just recently, 13 years later, my parents admitted that the night we got home, after I went to bed, they sat in the kitchen and cried for an hour straight. Story 9. When I was little and my mom was out of the house, my dad was the one who watched me and my brother, except he didn't really watch us. He'd just tell us to sit in front of the TV, then disappear into his room. Every so often he'd come out, but he wouldn't say a word. He'd just walk around the house, flipping random lights on and off, completely ignoring us. I remember the smell near his room, like something burning, almost like really bad popcorn. It was awful, the worst smell in the world. I'd ask him if something was on fire, but he'd just snap at me to go away. It wasn't until my early teens, after my parents' divorce, that I finally put it together. Every time my mom left, my dad was smoking crack. It might not be the most horrifying story compared to others, but to me, that's what tore my family apart. It's why I haven't seen my father in the last 7 or 8 years. Story 10. In 1988, my dad was driving us to school when he made a quick stop at the mechanic's shop to check on my stepmom's car. He parked parallel to the front of the garage so he could pull straight back onto the road. Since he expected to be in and out, and it was the 80s, he left the car running. About 30 seconds later, a man walked up, got into the driver's seat, and tried to put the car in gear. At 4 years old, sitting next to my 6-year-old sister, I didn't think much of it. We just assumed he was a worker moving the car out of the way. Then he turned to us and said, "Buckle up." Even now, that phrase sends chills down my spine. The car stalled as he tried to shift gears. Manual transmission, tricky clutch. That split second was all the time my dad needed. He came sprinting out of the shop with a couple of other men, ripped the guy out of the car, and wrestled him to the ground. I still went to school that day, completely unfazed. It wasn't until years later that I realized I was about to be kidnapped. Story 11. When I was about 9, the back of our school had a huge field that bordered a row of council houses. My friends and I always played at the far end of the field to avoid teachers while we acted out imagination games. Plus, we didn't have sun hats, and our school had a strict no hat, no play rule, so it was the perfect hiding spot. One day, when we got to our usual spot, an older man was already there. He seemed friendly and offered us berries, saying he had picked them from a tree nearby. He told us he lived in one of the council houses. Being 9 and not exactly the smartest, we ate them without a second thought. Then he offered us a drink, and we drank all of it. Pretty soon, we all started feeling sick. One of my friends was throwing up in class, which made the teacher freak out. That led to phone calls to our parents, the police getting involved. The whole thing escalated fast. It wasn't until years later that I realized what had actually happened. That nice man had given us alcohol. I asked my mom about it when I was in high school, and that's when I learned the worst part. The guy didn't even live near the school. He was a registered S offender. I had spent all those years thinking I had just eaten something I was allergic to. Turns out it was something much darker than that. Story 12. When I was 4, my family moved to a really nice suburban neighborhood. It was quiet, safe, the kind of place where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. One day, my mom was at work in the OR, and my dad was home watching me and my 1-year-old little brother. Suddenly, I saw my dad grab his gun and lock both of us in my brother's bedroom. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Don't open this door for anyone but me." Then he ran outside. A few moments later, I heard what I thought were fireworks. Curious, I ignored my dad's instructions and went outside to see them. But what I actually saw was a man across the street raising a gun to his head. Right in front of me, he pulled the trigger. I didn't understand what had happened. It was only later that I learned the full story. That fireworks sound was gunfire. A deranged man had been trying to shoot up our neighborhood. My dad, who was a cop at the time, was the first to respond because we lived right there. The closest on-duty officers were still 15 minutes away. At the time, I was just confused. But now I realize I watched someone take their own life. Story 13. I must have been around 3, though I can't really remember clearly. What I do remember is waking up to the sound of sirens, the kind that shake the entire night. We ran outside to see our neighbor's house completely engulfed in flames. As we stood on our lawn, watching in silent horror, firefighters carried something out and laid it on the grass. Just 20 feet away from me. It was small, blackened. It was my best friend's charred body. I stared at it, unable to fully process what I was seeing. It wasn't until my mom realized what was in front of us that she quickly pulled us all back inside. For weeks after, I kept asking when my friend would come back so we could play again. No one ever really answered me. At some point, I just stopped asking, and eventually I forgot. Or at least I thought I forgot. Decades later in my 40s, the memory came rushing back like a dam breaking. It hit me so hard that I had to confirm it with my mom. And she told me, yes, it was real. It all really happened. Story 14. When I was about 9, I was playing outside at a friend's house. Further down her street, there was a row of shops, and after they closed, we would go behind them to play ball games. There was a big wall back there, perfect for bouncing balls off. One evening, as we were playing, we found some money on the ground. Excited, we ran back to her house, feeling like we had just struck gold. But on our way, we kept finding more. Coins scattered along the sidewalk, a few crumpled notes here and there. By the time we reached her front door, our pockets were full. We burst inside, eager to tell her parents about our lucky discovery. But then we noticed something strange. There was even more money on the floor inside the house. We picked it up too, giggling about how lucky we were, and showed it all to her father. His reaction was unexpected. He took the money from us, told us he would give it to the police, and then added something that made me uneasy. He told me not to tell my parents because we could get in trouble. I didn't listen. When I got home, I told my parents everything, mostly because I was scared the police might show up at our door asking about the money. But instead of being worried about that, my parents just told me to never mention it again. And after that, I was never allowed to play with my friend again. I still wonder what really happened that day. Story 15. We were too poor to afford a babysitter, so whenever my mom went on dates, she took me with her. On one of her first dates, the guy took us to Chuck E. Cheese. He ordered a Hawaiian pizza but sent it back because, according to him, the chef had skimped on the pineapple. At the end of the meal, he didn't leave a tip, which was weird because all of my mom's other dates always did. When I asked him why, he looked me right in the eye and said, "A tip is like respect. It's earned, not given." After dinner, we played skee ball. He completely destroyed us. When I asked him how he got so good, he casually said, "I come here every night." That was strange enough, but then I noticed something else. He knew a lot of the kids there by name. Years later, I found out the truth. He wasn't just a guy who liked Chuck E. Cheese. He was a predator who prowled the place, looking for kids. Story 16. My mom, great-grandmother, 2 sisters and I were on a road trip home from North Carolina. I remember it so clearly because I was leaning forward between the front seats, showing my grandma something. Then my mom gasped. I looked up and saw it. A large SUV in the oncoming lanes flipping violently. It kept going, rolling across the grass divider, flying straight into our side of the highway. It finally crashed into the trees. My mom immediately pulled over. This was around 1994 or 1995, and she had a cell phone, still not very common at the time. She called the cops while other motorists rushed toward the wreckage to help. I sat there looking out the window. There was luggage scattered everywhere, pieces of people's lives just hanging in the trees. Then close to the wreck, I noticed something green lying on the ground. At first, I thought it was a sweatshirt, but as I kept staring, something felt off. I looked closer. It wasn't a sweatshirt. It was a body, folded in half. I pointed it out to my grandma, not really understanding what I was seeing. We left soon after, knowing we'd only be in the way of the ambulances. That moment is burned into my memory. At the time, I didn't associate it with death. It didn't even feel real. But later, as I got older, I realized there was no way that person survived. That wreck was horrific. And the thought of my mom and all those other drivers seeing an SUV flipping uncontrollably toward them, that must have been terrifying. Story 17. When I was about 6 or 7, I helped my best friend's dad pack up their house. I had no idea what was actually happening. To us, it was just a game. He told us we were packing for a camping trip. We were excited, running back and forth, carrying things to the car. We had no clue that he was abandoning his wife, his kids, his job, everything. After everything was packed, he sent us off to town, where there was a parade happening. He told us not to tell my friend's mom because it was a surprise. As young as I was, I didn't grasp the magnitude of what he had done. But later I found out he had completely cleaned out their bank accounts, taken all the money and valuables, and just disappeared. An hour later, my best friend's life was in ruins. They lost their house, they had to move away, and just like that, he was gone. To this day, I have no idea what happened to my childhood friend, his mom, or even his dad. But I know one thing. It was a despicable thing that man did. Story 18. I still swear that I saw someone burying a body in the woods when I was 14. I was riding my bike on a gravel road behind a cemetery in New Jersey when I noticed an old beat-up van parked nearby. Something about it felt off. Then I saw the hole, a shovel, and a man moving something from the van into the hole, something wrapped in a black garbage bag. It was shaped exactly like a body. The whole scene looked straight out of a mob movie. He saw me, froze. I didn't stick around. I just turned my bike around and pedaled home as fast as I could. That was 15 years ago. At the time, I kept telling myself I was just a kid, that I must have misunderstood what I saw. But now looking back, replaying every detail in my head, I still think it could have been a body. Thing weird, man. Story 19. When I was in first grade, there was this kid named Mikey. He was always well-mannered, always dressed to the nines, neater than any of us. One day, he got in trouble for something small. Maybe talking out of turn, getting out of his seat, or breaking some minor classroom rule. It wasn't anything serious, just the kind of thing kids do. The teacher gently reminded him of the rules and told him he would have to miss the first 10 minutes of recess. She also said she'd be informing his parents. That's when everything changed. Mikey lost it. He started crying uncontrollably, screaming, begging her not to tell them. "Please don't tell them. I'll have to drink hot sauce. I'm going to hurt so much." The teacher tried to calm him down, but he was inconsolable. Finally, she stepped outside to call for the principal. While she was gone, Mikey kept sobbing. We all just sat there watching. As first graders, we didn't fully understand what was happening. We just thought he was throwing a tantrum. We'd all done it before. Then he went quiet. He reached for his tie, the one he had worn to school that day, took it off and wrapped it around his neck, and then he started to strangle himself. At first, we were just watching in awe, not realizing the seriousness of what was happening. Some of us even whispered things like, "Wow, he's turning colors." No one ran to get the teacher. The week before, she had told us not to interrupt her when she was speaking to someone in the hall. We had bothered her with dumb questions. Can we sharpen our pencils? Can we color? And she had scolded us for interrupting. So, when this started happening, we didn't know any better. A couple of kids suggested telling her, but others reminded them of the no interrupting rule. Then she came back inside. The moment she saw him, she screamed and ran across the room. She yanked the tie off his neck, then turned on the rest of us, demanding why no one had come to get her. And in unison, we answered, "Because you told us not to interrupt." We were 6 and 7 years old. We didn't understand. The teacher and the staff member she had called for rushed Mikey to the principal's office. And we never saw him again. At the time, we didn't really think about it. The next day, he was just gone, an afterthought. But I've never forgotten him. As I got older, I started to realize what had really happened that day. A first grader, A 6-year-old child was so terrified of going home that he tried to take his own life in front of us. What kind of horrors must have been happening behind closed doors for that to be his reaction? I still think about him. I still wonder if he ever made it out. Story 20. If we count 15 as still being a child, then this was one of the defining moments of mine. I found my stepdad collapsed, covered in his own piss, surrounded by empty vodka bottles and scattered pills. I told my mom immediately, and she called an ambulance. They took him away, and she went with them to the hospital. Meanwhile, I felt this overwhelming urge to do something, to help, to somehow make things easier for my mom. So together with my 10-year-old sister, I started cleaning. We scrubbed the floors, picked up the pills, got rid of the bottles, erased the evidence of what had just happened. At the time, I didn't fully understand. I knew he had problems, but it took years before it really sank in. He wasn't just a struggling man. He was an alcoholic, drowning in depression and anger. And that day, he had tried to end his life. One thing I did understand, even in that moment, was that my sister didn't need to see this. When they took him away, I covered her eyes, just instinctively, as if I knew this was something that would scar her. 7 years later, she still thanks me for that. Story 21. When I was really young, someone tried to kidnap me. It was the early 90s, and I had gotten lost in a huge park in Toronto. A man approached me and offered to drive me home. I didn't think anything of it. I just assumed adults knew where all kids lived. I had never even heard of stranger danger. Just as he was about to take me, my dad appeared in the parking lot. He stopped the man, then calmly told me to go wait on the other side of a cube van that was parked nearby. Then I heard it, shouting, a loud thud, a short, sharp cry, the van shaking. A few moments later, my dad came back, picked me up, and carried me away. He had a cut above his eyebrow, blood running down the side of his face. I asked him what happened, and he just smiled and said, I thanked the man for finding you, but I tripped on the curb and hit my head. I believed him. For years, I believed him. Now in my 30s, I know the truth. I was almost kidnapped that day. And my dad? He beat the living shit out of my would-be abductor. Story 22. I used to have dreams of being in our old van and seeing a Barbie fly out of a car, its legs spinning and coming off. I told my mom about it, and she said, I can't believe you remember that. Apparently, when I was little and still in a car seat, my mom pulled our van over on the side of the highway because a wreck was blocking the interstate. A car behind us didn't see it in time and was going too fast. It hit the wreck head on. The driver was a pregnant woman, and she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. As my mother describes it, she burst through the windshield and landed on the road in 2 pieces. Her leg had been ripped off, and when the EMTs arrived, they had to cover her with 2 blankets. I guess I was too young to fully understand what I had seen. So in my mind, when I picture it, I just see a Barbie doll. Story 23. I grew up super poor. My late mother was a single parent, trying to keep 2 boys fed and sheltered. We bounced from place to place all the time when we were kids. My brother and I counted it up once. We had moved over 20 times by the time I was in middle school. My mom was pretty, but she was a middle school dropout in the early stages of multiple sclerosis, so she didn't have a lot of options. At one point, we had this skeezy old landlord named Leland for a place we were renting when I was about 8 or 9. My mom was frequently out of money, and occasionally we would make trips to Leland's house. I didn't like going there, but I was too young to stay home alone. My mom and Leland would go into another room, and I would sit in his living room, playing Super Punch-Out on a Super Nintendo he had. It wasn't until years later that I realized my mom had been sleeping with that old man when she couldn't make rent, just to make sure we didn't get kicked out of our home. To this day, I can't see or play Punch-Out without associating it with those bad memories. Thank you, Mom. I could never repay you for all the things you gave me. Story 24. I watched my brother get hit and killed by a car. I was 5 and he was 7. I just remember my mom hurrying him off to soccer practice because we were late. When he got out of the car, the driver who killed him wasn't paying attention and hit him. My mom flew out of the car screaming, pounding on the man's windows, begging him to stop. He said he thought he had hit a dog. That's why he didn't stop. He dragged my brother by his head for 75 feet. I still remember the scratches on his face, too deep to cover for his viewing. I really need to go to therapy for this. It's been nearly 20 years, but after finally putting down the bottle, I'm starting to really feel the trauma from that day. I flash back to that moment all the time. I have to grind my teeth, hold back the tears, and force myself to think of something else. Mostly I grieve for my mom. We both watched it happen. That day we became aware of real pain. So much Fing pain. I just wish he had died of sickness or something. Story 25. We had a friend who would occasionally call the house and somehow end up talking to my dad, or we'd be asked to give him a message. Then my dad would leave and come back with him. We had some curiosity about it, but I don't recall the specific conversations. Since it always ended in an overnight with our friend, who cares? Kid priorities. Anyway, just a few months ago, I finally got to ask him about it and prove my adult theory. He was being beaten by his alcoholic parents. My dad had set up a code for him to use when he needed help, and when things got bad, he'd call. My dad would go pick him up. Apparently one day he told his parents he was tired of their eshesh and that he could easily beat or kill them while they were too drunk to fight back. Hint, hint. Things improved a lot after that. He's still a mess, but he's getting better. It was over 30 years ago. Story 26. When I was in primary school, I'm Australian, my first teacher, my prep teacher, was this really nice lady in her 50s. I would have been 5, turning 6 that year, my first year of school. After that year, I moved schools. But I remember on the last day when my mom came to pick me up, she went into the classroom after school and talked to my teacher for a while. I remember seeing them come out into the corridor, both crying, and my mom giving my teacher a huge hug before coming over to me and leaving. I assumed my teacher was crying because I was leaving or something, and I didn't want to upset my mom by asking what had made her so emotional. Several years later, when I was around 9 or 10, Mom and Dad asked me if I remembered my prep teacher. I said of course, and they gently told me she had passed away. They showed me a notice in the newspaper. I was saddened, and they told me she had been sick with a disease. They mentioned the name, but at that age, I didn't really understand what it was. Years later, I found out that my mom had been comforting my teacher that day because she had been diagnosed with motor neuron disease, MND, also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. Knowing now how awful and terrifying that disease is, it absolutely breaks my heart to think of what she must have gone through, how her body and life were slowly and debilitatingly taken from her. Story 27. When I was a kid, I always got in trouble for being in the way. I'd be clogging up the hallway, stopping foot traffic, blocking the doorway, or leaning too far into the pathway. One Saturday morning, when I was about 7, I was sitting on the top step of our house, leaning back on my hands on the floor behind me. My dad came out of his room and stood on my hand, sipping his coffee and chit-chatting about our weekend plans. What chores I'd done, which ones I still had to do, what he was planning on getting done. I knew that if I complained, I'd just hear again how I was stupid, worthless, and always in the way. So I just smiled through the pain as he shifted his weight, grinding his boot into my hand. I kept my voice steady, answering with all my yes sirs as politely as I could. And after that, I made sure to be more careful, to stay out of the way. Years later, I stepped on a bug and felt it wriggle beneath my foot, even through my shoe, and it just hit me. He had to know he was standing on my hand, and he just stood there smiling, sipping his coffee, making pleasant conversation, while he willfully hurt a child. Story 28. Okay, here are 2 stories, one that happened to my cousin and one that happened to me. On September 11th, my cousin was a middle school kid, just a few blocks from the World Trade Center. He had gone to work with his mom that day. Right after the first plane hit, he and his mom saw a man get out of a cab, stand on the sidewalk for a minute staring at the tower, then open his wallet, take out the cash, and toss the wallet into a trash bin. He threw his briefcase away too, took off his tie and walked away from the towers, waving for another cab. He got in and disappeared. They didn't talk about it for years. It upset my aunt too much. But now they do. The leading theory is that he worked there and saw the chance to just get out. I don't know, but they both saw him throw his things away and leave. My cousin had no idea what was going on at the time, but years later, it finally clicked. The second thing happened to me. When I was a kid, my sister and I went to Disney World with 2 of our neighbors, siblings in their 20s. On the way, we got pulled over. The girl who was driving got out, and the cop pushed her up against the car. He slid his hand under her shirt for a long time, then under her skirt, while lecturing her about safe driving. They were right outside my window. I could hear him and sort of see what he was doing, but it didn't really register with me at the time. I remember a car passing by, honking, and the cop just waved to them while still groping her. It went on for about 15 minutes, then he let us go. She got back in the car and her brother said, "Better than getting a ticket." She just snapped back, "Phew, Tommy," and drove us home. Story 29. In second and third grade, my family used to carpool with another family since our school was a bit of a drive away. Let's call them the Johnsons. We alternated weekly. One week, my mom would drive in the morning, and their mom would pick us up after school. Then the next week, we'd switch. But every now and then, during a Mrs. Johnson morning week, Mr. Johnson would show up instead. It didn't happen too often, but it happened. I also remember one particular morning when Mrs. Johnson booked it the whole way, singing whatever came on the radio like she was in the best mood ever. It was weird because she wasn't usually that much of a morning person. I never had some big aha moment, but years later after we moved states away, my mom told me the Johnsons had gotten a divorce because Mrs. Johnson had been caught having an affair. My mom wasn't surprised though. She said Mrs. Johnson had a drinking problem. Apparently, every time Mr. Johnson showed up in the morning, it was because Mrs. Johnson was passed out from the night before and couldn't take her turn to drive. Other times, she might not have even come home at all. I never told my mom, but looking back, I'm 99% sure that on our sing-along ride, we were being driven to school by someone who had just finished a major binge. A first grader, two third graders, and two fifth graders, all packed in for a 35-minute drive with a drunk driver. I have no idea how she got away with it for so long. That could have gone so sideways. Story 30. My dad, who I never see, invited me and my big sister to the Capitol to go to an amusement park. My sister was skeptical. Why would he do that? But I convinced her because I hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. When we got there and were waiting outside the amusement park, my sister got a call from him telling us to come to the other side of the city. She sighed and said something like, "Here we go." I started crying because I just wanted to go in, but eventually we got on the bus. Turned out he wanted my sister to be a witness at his wedding to his new girlfriend, someone neither of us had ever met. Afterward, they basically said we could do whatever we wanted. They had no intention of taking us to the amusement park, but my sister took me there anyway and paid for everything out of her own pocket. I didn't fully understand why my dad never showed up. I just thought it was sad. But I remember my sister muttering, "Of that lying cunt," or something like that. I never saw him again after that. This had been going on for a long time, and only now do I truly understand. He never cared about us. Story 31. I found my mother's dead body hanging naked over the tub, as if she had been drawing a bath and passed out midway. I tried to wake her up by patting her back and saying, "Mom," even lifted her head back. Her face was a purplish hue, and somehow it still didn't register. I gave up and went to wake my dad, sat on the floor at the end of his bed and turned on the Ghostbusters cartoon, 1989, while he slowly got up. A few moments later, I heard commotion from the back of the trailer. One of my sisters passed me, crying. Then the second one came by. I asked what was going on, and she blurted out, "Mom's dead." But it still didn't sink in. Then Dad came through, crying. That's when I knew it was real. My sisters and I sat on the couch as the EMTs struggled to pull her past us in the living room. The morning sunlight lit up the sheet covering her on the stretcher. I'll never forget that day. I've had a lot of insanely fed-up things happen in my life, but that day, definitely in the top tier. Technically, it was only 15 minutes later in life, but the older I get, the more I realize just how far from normal it really was. Story 32. This didn't happen to me, but to my dad. He grew up in a small town in Canada, and when he was around 10 or 11 years old, he worked on an old man's farm. The old guy made it very clear that my dad could go anywhere on the farm, except for one specific room. You tried telling a 10-year-old boy not to go into one room. One afternoon, my dad went wandering, looking for something, and ended up stumbling into that room. Inside, the old farmer had pelts, not just any pelts, but lions, tigers, and all sorts of rare species, each hanging with a price tag. The farmer found him almost immediately, hurried him out, and warned him never to return. My dad never really thought much of it at the time. Years later, when it finally clicked, it was too late. He still feels ashamed that he never told his own father what he saw. I actually called my dad just now to see if there was more to the story. Turns out, years after his run-in with the farmer, the guy was caught illegally selling those pelts. Apparently, he had some shady connection smuggling them in for him. So he wasn't the one killing the animals, but he was definitely making a profit off someone who was. Story 33. I aged out of the foster system, so I lived in quite a few households as a kid. One of the first real connections I ever made was with a foster brother who was a year older than me. He took me under his wing and treated me like family. That meant everything to me. I was 6 at the time, with no real concept of what family even was. One year we got bikes donated to us as Christmas presents. It was amazing. I had never really owned anything before, aside from a few items of clothing. Having a bike all to myself when I didn't have to share was mind-blowing. My foster brother's bike was a little better, though. It had pegs on the back. I won't lie, I was a little jealous, but not in any serious way. We spent that summer riding in the dirt field behind our house, BMXing and pulling off jumps from whatever makeshift ramps we could throw together. Occasionally, some neighborhood kids would join us, but most of the time, it was just us two. One morning, when we got to our usual spot, a couple of teenagers were already hanging out on our dirt mound. We started showing off, trying to act cool, pulling off tricks, just being kids. But the teens didn't care about any of that. The only thing they seemed interested in was my foster brother's pegs. They kept trying to lure us away from our bikes. Now, looking back, I realized they were just trying to steal them. When we didn't fall for it, one of them straight up demanded the pegs. My foster brother refused. No way. Those bikes were our prized possessions. The next few moments are hazy in my memory. But I do remember one of the teens pulling out a gun. To this day, I don't know if he meant to pull the trigger or if it just went off by accident. The bullet hit my foster brother in his left eye and came out through his neck. I vividly remember watching his body go limp and hit the ground. I don't remember running back inside or calling for help, but I do remember being laser focused on his bike, making sure those teenagers didn't get it. I kept begging our foster mom to go get it, so he could have it when he came back from the doctor. That night, I stood at my bedroom window, trying to signal to the cops to grab his bike. I just didn't understand. In my mind, going to the doctor meant they fixed you. I even asked my foster mom if she thought he'd get stitches, but I never saw him again. Within days of the shooting, I was sent back into state care and placed in a boys' home. I kept asking my caseworkers when I could see my brother again. They always gave vague answers, never told me straight up that he had died. Then as time passed, turnover brought new caseworkers who had no idea who I was even talking about. So my brother just faded into memory. I grew up, moved on. But as I got older, I started to piece things together. Eventually, I looked him up and found the real story. Deep down, I had already figured it out. But seeing the truth written out gave me closure. I managed to locate his grave. Now, whenever I'm in the area, I visit him. Story 34. When I was a child, my family moved from the U.S. to Guatemala for 5 years. Right before we moved back, a lawyer was assassinated on our street while out for an early morning bike ride. That morning, I woke up and looked out our apartment window to see a blue tarp on the ground. Something was sticking out from underneath it, with a bicycle lying next to it. I spent hours watching through binoculars before I finally realized it was a body. But by that point, seeing bodies didn't really faze me. On the way to school, it was common to see one in a ditch or bushes near the road. Not every day, but almost once a week. Guerrilla groups often staged demonstrations, and as political corruption grew, they became more frequent. The public transit system, called chicken buses, was considered dangerous. As members of the U.S. Embassy community, we were told never to use them for safety reasons. Guerrillas would occasionally board a random bus and kill people to send a message. One time, coming back from a school field trip, our school bus was forced to wait outside the city for hours because guerrillas were staging a demonstration and executing chicken bus drivers across town. Another time, I was on a chicken bus with my older brother when a man casually boarded, pulled out a gun, shot the bus driver in the head, and exited out the same door. Just like that. All of it was shocking at the time, but I thought of it as normal. It wasn't until months after moving back to the U.S. that I realized how disturbing those experiences really were. Story 35. This isn't nearly as dramatic or life-changing as some of the stories I've read, but I guess it fits the narrative. I was around 3 years old on our family's farm in Middleburg, Virginia. My dad and I were inside a fenced-in area, about 4 acres square. On the other side, or so my dad thought, were around 30 cows and 2 bulls. Earlier that day, the animals had been moved to another quadrant, but no one had closed the gate. All I remember is my dad suddenly grabbing me and throwing me over the fence. I hit my head on it in the process. Still have a scar near my eye 35 years later. Turns out one of the bulls had not been moved. It went absolutely apesh. Breeding season had just started, which was why the bulls were left with the cows in the first place. It charged straight at me. All my dad could think to do was get me out, so he tossed me over to my uncle. The bull rammed into him, hitting the back of his leg, right above the knee, tearing his MCL. He always knew never to run from a bull, especially if it was in a defensive posture. But in that moment, breaking the rule probably saved my life. Story 36. When I was 4 years old, I found my stepfather dead on the couch one morning. Even 18 years later, I remember that day vividly. I was hungry and tried to wake him up so he could make me pancakes, but he wouldn't respond. My mom wasn't home, and I remember feeling scared and alone. Eventually, I walked across the street to our neighbor's house. We had only recently met them and had dinner with them once. I just stood there and said, "He won't wake up." After that, I sat in their living room and watched cartoons until my mom, the police, and an ambulance arrived. He had passed away from a heart attack in his sleep. He was only 24 years old. He was my best friend, the father figure I needed since my biological father was an abusive piece of shit. At 4 years old, I was upset, but I didn't fully grasp what had just happened. It wasn't until high school that it really hit me. How much I missed him, how unfair it was that he was taken from my mom and me after only 2 years together. I still think about him every day, and I can't help but wonder how different my life would have been if he had survived. Story 37. This memory has always stood out to me. When I was around 7 or 8, my family lived close to a casual restaurant, and if the weather was nice, we'd walk there for dinner. It was about a half-mile through residential streets. One evening in the fall, we were walking home after dinner. The sun had gone down earlier than my parents expected, so we took our time, being careful at intersections. As we passed the house of one of my dad's co-workers, we noticed a loud party going on. His son was clearly having a house party while his parents were away. Beer cans littered the lawn, and music was blaring. My parents and I stood there for a few minutes, laughing about how much trouble the kids were going to be in when their parents found out. They were using it as a lesson, showing me how irresponsible the kids were being. After a while, we kept walking. Story 38. My dad only watched me and my brother one day a week. My parents weren't divorced. He was just lazy. Half the time, he'd take us to the pool. I was about 2 years old and didn't know how to swim, but my older brother could, which apparently made him more fun. My mom enabled this mindset. She'd say the same thing when asked. So, my dad would give me a pool noodle or two, leave me in the middle of the pool to balance on them by myself for hours, and go off to play with my brother in the deep end, completely ignoring me. This went on for years. I didn't think much of it at the time. In my little kid brain, I turned it into a game. Balance on the pool noodles and don't fall off. It was bad enough that family friends started stepping in. They'd straight up tell my dad they were taking me for the day because they were worried about my safety, and he'd just let them. Later, when I was 13, my dad had already passed away, but my mom wasn't any better. She left me alone for a week so she could chaperone my brother's sports trip. Later still, when I broke my right ankle and elbow, she left me to fend for myself and a puppy for a month. That included the time when my extended family suddenly showed up, with no notice, to take my wheelchair for my grandmother to use. Thankfully, family friends stepped in again. Story 39. Growing up, I used to ride with my grandfather in his semi when he traveled to neighboring states, usually when I didn't have school. One time we were driving through the outskirts of Arizona on a back road in the middle of nowhere when we pulled up to an accident. An old Toyota had flipped over a drainage ditch, landing on its side. On the bank nearby, a girl was screaming at the top of her lungs, holding her friend, who was covered in blood. My grandpa immediately pulled over, rushing to help. In the chaos, he didn't realize I could see everything from the truck window. The girl's friend looked completely lifeless, her body limp, her face disfigured, blood everywhere, and from the crushed side of the vehicle, a hand was dangling out. For a long time, I didn't really process what I had seen. It felt unreal, like some horrible dream. I even started to believe I had dreamed it, until my grandpa brought it up years later. To this day, I can still picture the girl, screaming, clutching her friend's lifeless body. That image is burned into my memory. According to my grandfather, it was a group of drunk teens on their way to a concert. They weren't wearing seatbelts, and when they lost control, the two girls in the truck were thrown from the vehicle. He driver was crushed on impact, Only one of the three survived. Story 40. My mom and I were out to eat at a restaurant, one of those casual chain places, similar to a Perkins or Baker's Square. We had ordered our food and I was excited because I was allowed to get a shake. When it arrived, I took a sip and immediately felt something sharp in my mouth. I pulled it out. It was a small piece of glass. The server and manager apologized profusely, comped our meal, and seemed genuinely concerned. But then we noticed something. Sitting behind us was an African-American family. They had ordered before us but didn't receive their food until long after ours. When it finally arrived, it was cold. And worse, they also found glass in their food. But this time, the manager and server did nothing. No apologies, no comped meal, just a cold, indifferent attitude. My mom wasn't having it. She called the manager over again and told him flat out that the family's meal was going to be comped, just like ours. If not, she would call the police. She also told him that we were leaving immediately and would make sure everyone knew how racist this restaurant was, that we would never eat there again. The manager, red in the face, gave the family a half-hearted apology, but it was clear he didn't mean it. We waited until that family left, promptly, and then we left too. At the time, I understood the concept of racism, and I knew they were being treated differently because of their skin color. But I don't think I fully grasped how blatant and awful it must have felt for them, especially with their children watching. Looking back, I'm positive the glass in my shake was meant for their food. I grew up in the North, and while there weren't many minorities around, I had never witnessed racism like that before. I was proud of my mom that day. But as I got older, I realized just how bad that moment really was, and how much prouder I was of her for standing up and doing the right thing. Story 41. I was almost kidnapped as a child. We were living in Virginia Beach at the time. I couldn't have been older than 3. It was a warm day, and I was outside playing in our driveway, wearing my bathing suit and splashing around with a bucket of water. My mom was inside watching me from the kitchen window, but at some point she went down to the basement to get the laundry. That's when he pulled up. A man in a pickup truck. He called me over, smiling, with a dog in the passenger seat. I love dogs. Without a second thought, I ran right up to pet it. He squatted next to me, petting the dog along with me, talking to me, inching me closer and closer to the truck. I still remember how he smelled, like cigarettes. He was skinny, scraggly, weathered. Then he put his hands on me. And that's when my mom burst through the door screaming. The man bolted, shoved his dog back into the truck, jumped in, and sped off. My mom was hysterical, calling the police. I don't know if they ever caught him. I don't know what he went on to do after that. But my mom says it was the scariest moment of her life. She only looked away for a few minutes, and in those few minutes, everything could have changed. Story 42. Every day when I walked home from primary school with my granddad, we took the exact same route, same streets, same houses. One day when I was about 7 or 8, I started noticing something strange, a smell. There was this one house we always passed, and every time I'd feel nauseous. It was awful. The stench was so strong, so wrong, but the house looked completely normal, just like all the others on the street. I pointed it out every single day, but my granddad couldn't explain it either. It just didn't make sense. Then one afternoon, we saw something completely different. A bunch of men in full white hazmat suits were outside the house, setting up machines and equipment that I didn't understand. Some were in the garden, others were inside. I asked my granddad what was happening. He told me it was the Ghostbusters. He said the smell must have been from an ancient ghost who hadn't bathed in a while and had been living in that house. And obviously, that was the coolest thing ever to me, so I just accepted it. Years later, I was reading a newspaper compilation about particularly heinous crimes in my area, and I found that house. A disabled woman had been chained to a bed inside for nearly a year by her carer, who had fled, leaving her with no food, no water, no way to escape. She had starved to death in complete silence. Meanwhile, the carer was still collecting her disability checks from the council. So technically, my granddad wasn't wrong. It was a ghost. But knowing that smell was a human being rotting to death, that still gives me the heebie-jeebies to this day. Story 43. My school had a clear view of the Twin Towers on September 11th. I remember watching as the second plane hit. My classmates and I, first graders, laughed. We thought the pilot must have been the dumbest person alive for flying into such a huge building. How did they not see it? Our teacher didn't say much that day. We thought she must have been sick. Then my dad picked up my sister and me from school. I remember him scrambling between deadlocked traffic, trying to get us home to our apartment. People were screaming and crying. I didn't understand why. A few days later, my dad went looking for my uncle, who had never come back. He used to sell necklaces and souvenirs at the base of the towers. That morning, he had gone to work like normal. And then, nothing. No calls. No sign of him. I threw a tantrum until my dad finally let me go with him. But he made me promise, stay right next to me, no matter what. News had already gotten out about who was responsible. When we arrived at the site, I remember someone grabbing my dad and beating him. I didn't understand. I kept asking why they were hurting him. Then someone threw a brick at my head. I woke up in the hospital. It wasn't until 6th grade, when we finally learned the details of September 11th in school, that everything clicked. Suddenly, I understood why my dad shaved his beard, why we moved to California, why so many things had changed. Story 44. I know this will most likely get buried, but I think it's worth sharing. When I was in 1st grade, a close family friend of ours was diagnosed with terminal cancer. Her own family completely abandoned her when they found out about her illness. They were truly awful people. So we took her in. She became part of our family. She did everything with us: vacations, family reunions, holidays. She even moved states with us when my dad's job required it. But as time passed, her condition worsened. The chemo became more intense, and she rapidly declined. She could barely walk, and eventually my mom had to wheelchair her around. We covered everything: her medical bills, treatments, medications, even a breathing tank. This went on for 5 years. One night, when I was in 4th grade, I was sleeping in her bed, just in case something went wrong in the night, so I could wake my parents and get her to the hospital. I woke up in the middle of the night. She was walking, perfectly fine, picking things up around the room, moving like nothing was wrong. I dismissed it immediately. I was half asleep and didn't think much of it. It wasn't until 2 years later, when I randomly remembered that night and mentioned it to my mom, that everything unraveled. We discovered she had been faking her entire cancer diagnosis. I don't remember exactly how we found out, but it's worth mentioning. She was a doctor before her supposed diagnosis. She knew exactly how to fake every detail, down to the finest points. She had fake IVs in her chest. She shaved her head to appear as though she was going through chemo. She faked prescriptions, hospital trips, everything. But the worst part? We found out in court that she had been planning to kill my mother. She wanted to take her place in our family. And as a doctor, she knew exactly how to do it in a way that would have gone undetected. To this day, it sickens me to think about. And if I hadn't woken up that night and seen her walking, our lives could have turned out very different. We might have never known the truth. Story 45. When I was 10, my family and I were moving to a new house in a new state. It was the biggest house we had ever lived in, a 2-story house. We had already slept there one night, and it was amazing. That morning, we took the moving truck to pick up the last load of things we hadn't brought over yet. Then my mom got a call from the police. Our new house had caught on fire. The majority of our things inside were destroyed. The night before, there had been storms and flooding. Somehow, water had mixed with the electricity in our kitchen, sparking a fire after we left. My mom started crying. My brother and I didn't fully understand what was happening. We were sad, sure, but only on a surface level. Then we went to see the house. It was still flooded. My mom drove her car while my dad, my brother, and I followed behind in the moving truck. But the flood was too much for my mom's small car. It was totaled. So now, in the span of a single day, we had lost our house and our car. We had to move into a trailer and buy a used car. Some of our things were salvageable, but we needed a lot of help from the Red Cross. I remember donations pouring in from family, friends, even strangers. As a kid, it felt like Christmas. I wasn't traumatized. I didn't fully grasp the weight of it. It wasn't until years later that I finally understood how horrible it must have been for my parents. They worked so hard to buy that house, to build a better life for us, and in an instant, it was gone. I still remember my mom crying that day. It was such a heavy and burdensome obstacle for them, and despite everything, they persevered. I'm so proud of them.